All right, to everyone that's come in, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar on the topic Managing Traceability in the Manufacturing Sector. To start with, I'd like to introduce our speakers. My name is Syed Shah. I'm the Managing Editor for Manufacturers Monthly Magazine. And on the panel today, we have industry expert Roger Landman, who is the Product Operations Manager for SYSPRO. So Roger brings almost 30 years of experience in operations, including global manufacturing expertise in quality control, process engineering, and risk management. The objective for our session today is to equip you with the practical information and know-how you will need to implement a fail-safe traceability and product recall plan. So why do manufacturers need to have a traceability system in place? Simply put, you can't afford not to. So at the very least, a faulty product or contaminated food item will inconvenience a buyer. In the worst case scenario, it will be lethal. From a business perspective, recalls affect the bottom line and damage your reputation. But if you don't have an effective plan to mitigate the costs of a recall, it can be much worse than that. A business can easily go bankrupt and even face prosecution. Yet, despite an amplified focus on safety and compliance, there have been an increased number of product recall events around the globe. So why is that? For one, we live in a truly global world with international supply chains, whether that be in factories that manufacture our goods or where the raw materials for those goods are sourced from. So this makes it increasingly difficult for quality assurance managers to account for everything. And in addition to that, there have been increased incidents of product tampering. For example, the strawberry needle scare of 2018 in Australia is still fresh in our memories. And with the current COVID-19 situation, the need for effective traceability is all the more salient. So before I address our panel, I will briefly outline our agenda for today. So we will be discussing the background to traceability, how it's defined and its purpose, as well as the current legislative considerations in both a global and a local context. Then we will go into more depth on how you can create a traceability system and implement product recall procedures and plans. Further to that, we will talk about the role of the SYSPRO ERP system and the customer traceability experience in using this system. So, well, good morning, Roger. Thank you for joining us, all the way from South Africa.
Good afternoon, Syed, and to the attendees. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's afternoon there. Sorry about that. So to kick
morning, afternoon, mate.
Thereabouts. Well, anyway, to kickstart our session, let's start with a definition, Roger. So you've previously defined traceability as the ability to trace the application, location, and/or history of an activity or item by means of recorded data.
Thanks, Syed. Well, yeah, it's always good to start with a definition. And that definition I think for our purpose is close enough. But I think let's go back to the word or the root of the word, and that is the word trace. So as a verb, it means follow the trail of something. Traceability to us, therefore, is the quality of being able to follow the trail of the product. I think for the purposes of what we're trying to cover here, the full definition would be to be able to identify a unique batch, identify all the individual raw materials used in that batch, follow the batch and each individual unit through production and distribution to the immediate customer.
And so can you provide a brief background as to how we have come to define traceability and why this process is so essential to manufacturing in this sense?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight how essential it is to manufacturing. It's a very good question. So the very nature of manufacturing is such that defects will occur from time to time. And those defects do slip the noose and end up in the marketplace. Depending on the criticality of the component, it may need to be recalled or not. The defining criteria, though, is whether that component poses a risk to the well-being of the public. So therefore, traceability is essential to any manufacturing operation that manufactures any parts that may end up affecting the well-being of the public.
And based on your experience, Roger, and with some examples, of course, how much does a recall, how much can it cost?
Tricky question, that. From past experience, I can say that product recalls are never cheap. I've had a few big claims on and I've put some up on the slide. It's amazing looking at those numbers, how these companies have actually survived. But as a rule of thumb, if you catch it early, then it's relatively affordable, but leave it unattended and it'll become very costly very quickly. Any potential recall starts off with a worst case scenario. So you always get massive numbers and typically very scary numbers. And we're talking in the region of over $1 million US. And from there, they can go either way. Sometimes they get worse as the investigation progresses, and sometimes they get much better. If you can find the root cause, then we generally find that it gets much better and you are then able to mitigate the defect correctly. I've had them go both ways though. So as an example, there was a case that I was involved in, which involved baby formula cans that were not airtight. There was a leak in the foil on the peel-off ends. So the initial claim was, converting it to Australian dollars, 4.5 million. As the customer had quarantined everything and said, it's all yours, we want nothing to do with it. So I ended up owning 120 tons of baby formula. Working carefully with that supplier, we managed to mitigate the claim all the way down to Australian dollars 38,000, which really was for the damaged packaging material. So we had done our research, we had done a lot of work on it, we knew exactly what the defect was. So therefore it was easy to mitigate. And at the end of it, we could sort and recover just about all the cans. There was only a very low percentage that were defective, and it was quite surprising. The traceability that we had on the foil was exceptionally good because it was a food product, and we knew exactly the defective coil of the aluminium, which pallets were produced from that coil, and where they were sent. So we could track everything right out into the marketplace and ring fence it. I've also had them go the other way and have ended up chasing product all over the world and eventually costing me 5.5 million US dollars. What you'll typically find though is on some of these, it's very expensive to bring back all the defects to the factory. So you tend to scrap it in the foreign country where they are. Sometimes the transport costs will exceed the value of the defect. So you want to try and reduce costs as much as possible while you're solving the recall. So we would just scrap it where it is. I think though the automotive recalls are the most popular because of the risk to consumer safety, and the big recalls quickly end up exceeding $1 billion, as we've seen already on a couple of these slides shown here.
Right.
On the next slide, I've put in some of the really big claims. So the first one that I want to just talk about is the Takata airbags, which has affected 63 million vehicles worldwide, and so far has cost around $18 billion. This is all US currency. And ultimately it bankrupted the company. So as we said earlier, the worst case is where these things start, and it was originally $24 billion. So the fact that it's only $18 billion will take. Just as an understanding, Takata employs over 50,000 people worldwide and has facilities on 4 continents. They're that big, and yet something like this has wiped them out. One that's really prevalent at the moment is the Boeing 737 MAX, which is busy crashing. So they've had 2 planes go down, and that stopped the sale and everything to do with that aircraft. It's cost Boeing so far $19 billion US, and it's costing them $60 million US per day. So the latest talks are now that without a $60 billion bailout by the US government, Boeing will collapse. This is scary numbers. Closer to home, I just want to highlight your 2018 contamination of the strawberries with the needles by a disgruntled employee. So the estimates so far show that it's cost the Australian strawberry industry about $12 million. But the worst case was a whole lot worse than that, because it's a $500 million industry, which they thought might not survive. And this $12 million does not factor in all the brand damage, all the people that were laid off, and several farms that were unlikely to survive.
Right. And in terms of legislation in this case, what are the key laws that, govern compliance, safety, and product recalls in this country, in Australia?
Yeah, so it's always an important part to fully understand exactly what the legal side of the problem is likely to be, because I think this is the one that worries us the most. We'll only touch on it here though, because I'm not a legal person, but I think there are a few very important points to be made. The first one is that there's a very wide range of national and state legislation, as well as a lot of industry-specific regulations that all consider recalls. In my research, I found 2 main pieces of legislation. There's the Australian Consumer Law, which seems to be the main piece of law that addresses product recalls. I think that's what I've got up on the slide at the moment. I also then researched vehicle recalls, because these seem to exceed all the typical product recalls, and that is managed by the Department of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development and Communication. What I found quite interesting though is that the recall actually is managed by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, who administer the ACL, Australian Consumer Law. And also the industry-specific regulations. The problem that I noticed is that the recall can only come from the ACCC. It does not come from any of the other bodies. So nobody likes the law. So I've just quickly summarized the critical elements of the Australian Consumer Law on the slide. And it covers the compulsory recall of goods and the voluntary recall of goods. It's important to understand this, because this is what's going to manage or what happens to your industry. I'm not reading it to you, I've just put it up so rather you understand that there is a piece of legislation that governs these recalls and you need to understand it. Continuing from the previous slide, there's also a section of law that deals with suppliers having to report consumer goods that are affecting the public. So what has happened now is the law has shifted the onus onto a manufacturer to report a known or suspected issue. And I'm not sure what non-reporting is going to involve. And then finally, there is in just about every place that I've looked, the ability of the consumer to report any risky item to the authorities. So there's a strong point of self-monitoring that now enters the question. But the self-monitoring and reporting seems to be a common practice around the world.
I see. And so in this case, how does Australia, in this case, compare with the rest of the world? For example, like European countries.
So how well is Australia regulated, I think is the question.
Yeah.
The next few slides tell a tale. So I've listed some of the legislation from the USA and the European Union, and I found lots of legislation and lots of regulation. So 2 things immediately stick out to me. The first one is that there's far more legislation and regulation in these two big economies to deal with non-compliance by manufacturers. But I also see a lot more enforcement. And the second point I think that is more important to make at this stage is that the regulation is far more prescriptive in how products are labeled or identified. Like we see the example of the livestock in the USA requiring RFID traceability. With far more regulation around labeling and traceability, the recall process has to be more robust. There's also the other side to the coin, and that is that there's a lot of manufacturers that will go beyond the requirements of the law. And if you're supplying into somebody who's a really tight on legislation and compliance, I would suggest having a meeting and fully understanding exactly what their requirements are and what the implications of those requirements are. Perhaps I should just make a note here and say that I'm not a legal person, and would strongly recommend that the organization understands with the legal organization their obligations under the legislation and the industry regulations. So let's take a look at the regulator. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC as they are known. They have a wonderful website with all the current recalls. So if there's anything that anybody needs to understand or is thinking about, go on there and have a look. I think it's worth mentioning at this point that doing some research on their website that I found on the 24th of April, 2020. So this is what, 2 weeks ago, amid the COVID crisis. There were 7 recalls in one day. 2 for Volvo cars, 1 for Scania buses, and a few other items. So even in this critical time, these things are taking place around us. So let's take a look at some of the statistics, because I think this answers the question on whether there is a problem. So we can see from the slide that there are people dying or getting injured daily from unsafe goods in the economy. 780 deaths and 52,000 injuries per year on average. And the cost to the economy is a staggering $5 billion. Breaking that down a bit, I think it's simpler to say that there's 6.6 million individual products under voluntary recall as we sit here today. And of those, there's 1.7 million recalled products that have still not been returned. In simple language, this is 1 in 4 households now have an unsafe product in that house. So how at risk are they? I think trying to quantify the size of the problem, let's compare to some of the other countries. So Australia, we talk about 650 recalls per year. This is including your motor vehicles and things like that. The USA average is about 4,200 per year, including their motor vehicles. But it's roughly 410 by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the FDA amount to about 2,800. So the FDA manages all their food and drugs, and you'll see there's a lot of that in the USA. In the European Union, there was 2,080 in 2019, and in Japan, all we know is that there was more than 1,000. Unfortunately, their website is in Japanese, so I couldn't translate much more than that. The point that I want to make here is that as a per capita statistic, we need to look at the Australian numbers versus all of those. And I think we can see that the Australian numbers are a bit higher than the rest of the world. In the process of researching what I was busy with, I came across an alarming disclosure from the ACCC. And that was that, and I'm going to quote it, many people would be surprised to learn that there is currently no law that requires businesses to not sell unsafe products. This is a huge issue because it means that people can sell unsafe products with little recourse. I know that this is going to be receiving some urgent attention, but it still remains that there's no specific law to stop businesses breaking the law. I find that quite interesting. So this will certainly not stack up against countries like the USA and the EU, as we've seen from above. The EU, for example, applies a law of negligence in such cases. So then the question becomes, is the Australian legislation not holding the perpetrators accountable, or is it not able to enforce this legislation? I think it's a question of both. Looking at the amount of law enforcement there is in the land of the free, i.e. the USA, everybody there is able to force compliance, whereas I don't think it's quite the same in Australia. Finally, this raises a very important question for any manufacturing business. And that is, if you're going to be exporting to these bigger trading partners, the legislation and the regulation in the trading partner country may expose the organization to legislation that could end up in its demise. We've spoken about the Takata airbags, and even though they're a Japanese company, they were bankrupted in the USA.
Well, I guess this brings us to, why you need a traceability system. So, when we talk about a traceability system, what should this system consist of, Roger?
Right, so now we're getting right into the heart of it. It's the traceability system that makes the whole system tick. So a traceability system, for what I require or for what I'm advocating, requires 4 main steps: define, document, review, and test. So this is the heart of the product recall system now. No traceability system, no recall.
All right, let's look at it in more detail.
Sure.
So to start with, let's discuss the importance of scope over here. So why should a business scope out their system carefully?
So this is a very important part and probably the most critical step of the whole system. The scope of the system will determine how big is the system, i.e. its size. But the caveat that I want to bring in here is the system must suit the capability of the business. It's no good designing a system that the business can't support. So full traceability of a product requires a one-up, one-down system. Supplier traceability, i.e. the ability to trace all the supplier's products coming into the organization. The process traceability, which is the traceability of all the products moving through the organization, whether they're new products or not. And it's important to understand that, because here we start talking about some items are bought in and just sold out. We need to be able to trace those. We need to know where they came from, if they were changed, if they were repacked, if packaging changes, if it's a part order. All those sort of things can all impact on the traceability. And finally, we need to have our customer traceability. So we need to know exactly what we've sent to which immediate customer. And it's important that you focus on the word immediate. What the customer's customer does and what happens in the customer's system, you have no control over it. So we need to put together a seamless interface between all of these 3 systems. And that is the only way that we will actually have a robust system.
Right. And in this case, I guess there also comes the importance of documentation. So how important is this, Roger?
So from past experience for me, I think it's also one of the critical steps. The moment you have a crisis, a major recall, the system stresses out and people just stop thinking. It's chaos. I've been there. So what we're advocating here is it's imperative to have the system carefully documented right down to the last detail. Who does what? What must be done? What is the sequence? What are the timelines? But it's also important that we detail how we manage each product. Some products will need to be managed a certain way, other products will need to be managed differently. So what we're doing here is we're pretty much building a playbook like a US football team. Every scenario has an outcome and it's been considered. So all they do is they just follow the play, step by step by step by step. And that should lead to a touchdown, i.e. in our case, a successful recall.
And who should be involved in the review process?
So I'd like to say everyone, because everybody's got something that they can add. But the biggest suggestion or the most critical way of doing it, as far as we've experienced in the past, is to use a multidisciplinary team. Each person has a unique set of knowledge on how their department functions and what will work and what won't work in that department. Each department typically you'll find runs a slightly different process. And this diversity will actually make the system as robust as you can get it in that organization.
And I suppose there needs to be testing. So why is it so important to test the system?
So we advocate testing for two reasons. The first is that everybody in the team is familiar with the system. The second one is also that the organization has satisfied itself, and I refer to the leadership of the organization because they're the people that will ultimately be held accountable, so that the organization can display the required traceability. When you're standing in court, you need to be able to show them that your system does work and you've considered everything. So typically at this point, we would say the check should be two. There's two basic checks to be done. The first one is a horizontal check. So we pick a place in the process and we audit several batches that are going through that same point to make sure that we can trace them backwards. The second one is what we call a vertical check. And here we follow several batches from the customer all the way up through the process. So we go back up the supply chain and make sure that we can trace it all the way to where the product came into the supply chain. This we typically call the mock recall. So it's a test of the system to make sure that this is how it's done. If you follow these four main steps, I'm confident that you'll be able to put together a system that will cover all of your requirements.
Great. And so what is the objective of a product recall, and how does a business go about doing a recall?
This is the good stuff now, Syed. We're getting to the heart of the conversation. We need to describe all the elements, which we've done, but now we need to put them together. So you have a traceability system, but that's not going to recall your product. It's going to help you find it. So the high-level answer to your question is the objective of a product recall is simply to protect consumer health. The more formalized definition is to protect the public health by informing consumers of the presence on the market of a potentially hazardous product, and by facilitating the rapid identification and removal of these products from the distribution chain, ensuring that the unsafe products are either destroyed or rendered safe. I'll cover how the business undertakes the product recall shortly.
So can you discuss the different types of product recall?
Sure. And I think we need to understand these differences. So there's three types of recalls. There's the mock recall, which is used by the organization to test the traceability of the product from the customer to the supplier. This we discussed above as the vertical check and the test under the test phase of the system. A quick way to do that is to go and buy a can of your own product, or go and buy one of your own items from the retail shops, and take that back to the business and say, right, find out the whole history of this product for me. Then we have the product withdrawal, which is the removal of the product from the distribution chain. But this is before it's reached the customer. So at this place, it's just straight communication with members of the supply chain. And finally, we have the worst of the worst, the formal product recall. And that is the removal of the product from the distribution chain when goods have been sold to the consumer. The problem with this is it involves communication with consumers due to the potentials of risk to public health.
And what are the most critical steps of a product recall plan?
Okay, so typically your product recall plan has 7 main steps. Firstly, we need to develop the recall policy. We then develop the recall plan on which we build on from the traceability system that we've discussed above. We then need to test this product recall plan. So remember now, we're not testing the traceability aspect of the plan, but we're now testing the ability to be able to recall a product. So we know we can find the product because we've done the mock recalls. But what is it going to take to get that product out of the supply chain and reduce the health risk to the public? There's the notification and initiation of a product recall. There's management of the product recall. There's the closing of the product recall, and this is quite an important step as well. We need to gather up all the evidence. We need to keep it together. We need to keep all of our documentation and records together so that if we need to revisit it, we've got it all in one place. It's not spread out throughout the office. And finally, there's the review of the product recall, because we need to go through our process, and I'm sure we will find areas to be amended or improved. So I've given you 7 main steps over there. But to me, I think step number 5 is the most critical, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail in the next slide.
And so once a recall is in progress, why, 2 things, why is the plan, number 1, why is it so important? And secondly, and how many times should a business trial their plan?
Okay, so I'm going to answer those two questions separately. So the first one is, why is the plan so important? Well, as we've covered above, we know that under the conditions of a product recall, the business goes into stress mode and people stop thinking. So therefore, the product recall should be driven by the plan. This plan, we've spent time, we've carefully developed it in a no stress situation, and time has been taken to carefully consider each of the activities and its risks, things like the critical steps, the timelines, and so on. So we're confident that we've done a good job building the plan. The difficulty that we now face is, here in step number 5, is the first time that the business must face the public. So there's information all over the public space, and it needs to be collected firsthand. Past experience has shown that if you don't go and collect that information firsthand, there's always some type of bias, skewing, missing information, or something that leads your investigation to be incomplete. In the process of collecting information, we'll find that there's a lot of difficult questions are being posed by the people involved. And further, this information is not in one place. So we tend to end up going to multiple places for sources of information. So the plan will now come together, and it should be guiding how effectively the organization removes the threat from the public domain. In covering all of these scenarios, it should also be covering what are the likely questions, how these should be answered, and it's best to get people who know what, or who can guide you on this, because the wrong answer can implicate you in litigation. The second part to what you're asking is, how many times should the company trial their plan? Well, my advice is as much as necessary until it delivers what it should.
Thanks. And Let's go back to the documentation portion. So coming back to that, so why is record keeping so critical when a recall is in motion?
Yeah, this is a good point that you're making here, Syed, because it's often overlooked, but actually very critical to the whole process. So there's a person that's been allocated to document everything in the plan and is making copious notes all day long. But why? So this chronology of activities will serve as the internal record keeping, but it will become critical if there's any legal proceedings. Most of these cases take years to get to the courts, by which time either your key staff have left the organization or the detail that was so carefully kept in somebody's head has been forgotten. And nobody wants to sit there and tell the judge that they cannot remember, or when asked something, they think so. Another important aspect of all the documentation is it's not always your claim that you're working on. Sometimes it's a claim from your suppliers. And then the legal teams get busy when you try to claim from them. So without these accurate records, there's often no claim that you can put in. I've personally had to claim against suppliers, and it's not that easy. I make a point here that if you're going to go in and start documenting in the process of a recall, it's always good to alert your company lawyers and your insurers. The insurers, because if there's a potential risk to the business, they need to know about it. The lawyers, because they may need to guide you so that you don't implicate yourself. There's another aspect to all of this, and that is the business continuity plan. Remember though, even though the business is in a recall, for the rest of the business not involved in that product or still making the same product but not the one that's been released into the marketplace, it's business as usual. And you can't stop your whole business because you're in a recall. You need to carry on. And it's important that this is factored into the thinking as well.
Right, and thanks for explaining that. And so, Roger, I suppose a very good ERP system is necessary in this case. So, could you provide us with an overview as to how the SYSPRO ERP system can resolve some of the challenges that manufacturers face in terms of traceability and product recall, the product recall procedure?
Sure, but I think let's take a step back and let's first define what an ERP is. So ERP is an industry acronym for Enterprise Resource Planning. So it's a piece of business software that's been designed to record and manage all the data across your enterprise. Broadly speaking, it refers to the automation and integration of the company's core business processes so that they can spend more time focusing on the effectiveness and success of their business. So when we talk about integrating, we talk about core business processes such as customer orders, scheduling operations and the like, keeping the records, financial data. It's a high-speed interrogation system as well of all these records. So you'll see that the ERP then becomes fairly critical in managing a product recall. So now that we've covered what the ERP is, let's take a look at the SYSPRO ERP offering. So SYSPRO is one of the bigger industry-specific ERP solutions, and it's designed to simplify complexity and focus on adding value to the manufacturing and distribution businesses. It's industry-specific to support these business systems. And SYSPRO does offer a full traceability system. So if you're ever in a product recall, it will help mitigate that. So let's take a look at what the SYSPRO traceability system is. So the solution was developed within the SYSPRO ERP to track and trace material products throughout the supply chain, right from where they received into the organization until they dispatched out of the business. So the traceability system, as it sits in SYSPRO, was developed to support a product recall system by being able to easily track any products in the system as well as quarantine them. This integration into the ERP is critical to your product recall, as it can extract all the information that you need in a couple of minutes. We've tested this and we can verify that. It also has the added functionality of being able to deal with customer complaints, manage your returns, especially when time is of the essence. So having a fully integrated traceability system in one centralized place allows you to take the actionable steps and quickly impact the issue or the recall. This will help improve governance, but it can also help us trace and report on every aspect of the supply chain in real time. So one of the problems that organizations can find themselves with is if the traceability system is an add-on and not fully integrated into the ERP, it may not be able to deliver all of the information that is needed in the time frame that it's needed. Okay, looking at SYSPRO and the product recall. The SYSPRO traceability function is designed for batches, or lots as we call them in SYSPRO, but it also covers serial traceability, which are single items needing unique traceability. It also supports the critical functionality that we know you'll need in a product recall, which is the quarantining function for any stock still on site, and the product recall, which will find out exactly where the effective products were sent and where they can be found. In a recall, typically we want to cast the net as wide as possible and then eliminate the products that are not affected by the defective product and release those. So let's take a look at the product recall system and I'll show you some of the functionality. So you can see in the system menu that there's a section for product recall, which is part of lot traceability. So I've prepared some sample data, and this picture that you're seeing is just a screen grab of that. So we made some bread, and after we distributed it into the community, some people got sick after eating that bread. We've done some investigation, and we've traced the delivery of the bread to their shop as lot 505. Lot 505 is the third one down. As you can see, it's the batch of bread. But we can also see this as a parent item. So we need to understand all of the ingredients. What we're seeing is a screen of lots of finished goods and ingredients. So this is a list of all the finished goods and the ingredients that are all related to lot 505. Any product that has shared any of the ingredients used in lot 505 is also listed here. So this is in effect every potentially affected product. We now see that lot 505, the bread, was manufactured in job 703. So now we need to look for everything from job 703. We've sent the raw materials from job 703 to the laboratory. They've done their analysis and they've identified that the butter used in the bread is the problem. The butter that we refer to here is called butter A, lot 201. So now we're looking for all the related products that used butter A, lot 201. And pulling this up out of the system, we then look for every job that has used any of those components used in job 703. And we find that we have job 691, 699, and job 705. So we now know that they consumed the same lot of butter, lot 201, and are all suspect. They will need to be quarantined. Going a step further now and interrogating lot 505, we find that it was sent to two customers, customer 001 and customer 018. From the system, we can also see exactly the quantity that was delivered to them. So the batch was 100 loaves, and 66 loaves were sent to customer 001, and 34 loaves were sent to customer 018. So we can now account for all the items produced in that batch and exactly where they are at those two customers.
So having covered traceability in a lot of detail there, all right, what would you suggest, Roger, as the next steps for a manufacturing organization?
So absolutely. So we've shared a lot of information and theory here. So I guess the real question that's sitting in the audience now is, what do I do with this information? How do I apply this information in my business? So I typically advocate a two-pronged approach. They'll run in tandem because some processes will take a while. Firstly, an external process where people start engaging with their industry bodies, insurers, and also get legal opinion on the local legislation where you stand and where you stand with respect to it. This is fairly important because this will determine exactly what is likely to go wrong, and you can start mitigating that. The second one is your internal processes. So we've got a link to our ebook that we've produced, and I would suggest taking this ebook, understanding it, and auditing your system to find all of the shortcomings. Build an action plan and get busy closing on and close down all of these gaps. And just as a final check, when you think you've got it right, make sure that you can trace the batch right through your system. If you have raw materials that are shared between products, then you'll need to develop a what-if functionality so that you can see if there's any potential cross-contamination, like we showed in the example above with the butter. Then finally, you will get to the difficult part of any recall. And that is trying to convince the regulator that all your suspect components have been removed from the public domain and are fully accounted for. With the SYSPRO lot and serial traceability, we've tested this on a number of different products, and we can successfully tell you that this can be achieved in just a few minutes.
Well, so Roger, that's a very detailed explanation over there. So, so in your experience, could you talk us through like a real example, on an application of a product recall and how the SYSPRO ERP actually helped manage that product recall? Any real life examples, a case study or that sort that you can share with us?
Yeah, well, I've traveled the world solving product recall issues, customer complaints. So I have certainly a good few. But there's one interesting recall that I think is worth discussing. And that was in Abu Dhabi in the middle of summer. So you can imagine visiting a customer in a suit and tie when it's 48 degrees in the shade. It was certainly very uncomfortable. So normally you'll first be notified that there is a problem, and you'll receive some type of complaint from the customer. And at that point, I always ask the customer to immediately isolate all the problem or suspect components. I then also ask them to send me samples so that I can actually investigate what's going on before I walk into the customer cold. I do my research, I formulate my hypothesis, and then I test it. I'll do things like run an advanced root cause analysis on the defect, try and get a big picture of what the problem is. So then I will go and visit the customer, and I am typically very well prepared. And I take a lot of information with me so that if questions are raised while I'm there, we can answer that. In arriving at this customer, I was certainly very well prepared, but I was not ready for a boardroom full of defects. On this particular trip, I took the plant technical manager along as well. And that was because this complaint was one of the, or it was at one of the biggest aerosol fillers in the world. So we met at the plant and they literally brought in thousands of cans that were defective. A whole range of defects, because that's what typically happens in these situations. They just bring everything that's wrong. Some of the defects were minor, some were critical. So we separated out everything and we started looking at the critical defects first, because this is what the recall was about. And these were very concerning because we had purchased some very specialized equipment to identify exactly those defects and to reject those cans. So how were we still finding them? And the more we separated cans and started working through things, the more we figured out something was definitely amiss here. Traceability in this particular case on the aerosol cans is with an ultraviolet date code on the bottom of the can that can only be read using an ultraviolet light. This is for a number of reasons, one of them being complaints that if you put a normal ink date code on the can, it affected the aesthetics and things like that. So there is this technology out there that you can use. Problem is that the customer did not know this. So when we started going through all these defects, we then started checking the base of the can for this UV date code. And there was no date code. So from that point of view, our problem was solved. The cans were not ours. So we had no liability in that claim and nothing to do with that recall. But I think the learning points are quite important here. And that is for any complaint that entails you physically going to see the customer, it's normally large enough to be a problem. So I would make sure that you're properly prepared. Also take along some process experts who can quickly identify the typical type of problem that you're dealing with. And take as much information as you can with you. In this particular case, we took all the batch numbers, we took the manufacturing dates, so that we could verify the samples that were defective against those dates. And also take all your traceability info. You don't really want to sit there and not be able to answer questions. Then we checked the traceability system. Well, I was quite excited that ours worked very well, and we had all the information that we needed, as well as we had the unique mark that identifies our product. The problem now came to the fact that their traceability system was non-existent. So they had no record of any product through their process, except for a pallet number. But they couldn't identify which of the cans had come off that pallet in their newly packed pallet. There was no linkage. And they did not have any traceability. So that caused a massive problem in trying to resolve this, because they themselves were not in a position to recall the product if they needed to.
All right, that actually was very interesting sharing of an experience, a case study there, Roger. So thank you very much. And well, everyone, that pretty much concludes our panel session, but it's not over yet. Please stick around for the question and answer session. All right, but before that, this is a reminder that the ebook that Roger mentioned earlier in one of his earlier slides that covers all of this in far more detail is available from the SYSPRO website. I think it's stated there in the slide. It shows you the gives you the link, and you can actually contact your friendly your SYSPRO experts. First, you can get Todd Hunt, who is the sales director for SYSPRO in Australia. You can email him at todd.hunt@syspro.com. And of course, today, you have Roger Landman. You can get him at who is the product operations manager for SYSPRO. You can reach him at roger.landman@syspro.com. All right. Now, look, I understand much earlier we had a poll going on. I understand that the poll's actually closed. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to relaunch. So I know there's like about 70-ish of participants out there. So I'm going to relaunch the polls again, just to have like a quick look through. It's on how product recalls, were like in the past 5 years, and how product recalls, whether they were successful or not. So Roger, because it went on, and there were just only 20 plus of them actually had a chance to, but we have got so many people today, so we just want to let them have a go at giving their thoughts on that. Let's so I'll just have a go at that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So first one I have over there is on have you had a product recall in the